is co-production and international distribution. So if you think back again to our week on national and world cinemas, I got you to do the exercise in workshops of going to find how many Australian films there were, and it was quite ambiguous in some cases. Is this Australian film, isn't it? You know, it's half paid for by this country, what's going on? That is the state of co-production that we'll be looking at, and that alongside international distribution is probably the key markers of globalization in the media for countries that are not the very powerful countries in terms of the media, so not the US or to a slightly lesser extent the UK. So if media is circulating around the world, if anyone can potentially access it online, how are we then can we even define such a thing as, say, a national media source? So,
there was Mad Max and Fury Road and Mad Sibs.
Yes, but Mad Max and Fury Road.
They're filmed in Africa, so it doesn't count.
Well, I guess that's the issue I'm raising is whether or not something counts and whether or not it's actually important whether it counts. Who does it count to? So there's different ways of demarcating it. It might be in terms of consumption. It's most commonly in terms of production. Ownership and the funds put in. We talked about that idea of, you know, what does it represent? Does it have particular themes that we can distinguish? And if you think of something like Neighbours, for example, or Home and Away, that are both produced in Australia, but their main market is the UK in terms of consumption, that kind of sets up a situation where, yes, it's an Australian production, but it's very much geared towards potentially UK audiences, and how does that then potentially impact on them as texts? So there's those sorts of issues at hand. Whether or not there is a need for these kinds of demarcations, I am not entirely convinced. But the reason behind the idea of having sort of the national media is because smaller countries cannot compete in the media economy, in the sort of free market of the media, unless they have some help. So in order for them to have some help, the government needs to put in money in order for and you'll see there was a huge outpouring of French cinema in the sort of 90s, early 2000s, and a lot of that had to do with the government investment in the idea that we needed to have more French language content for their citizens to watch. But then, you know, you have to decide, what are you going to put money into? Are you going to put it into Fury Road that is largely produced in Australia, filmed in Africa, has money from the US, distributed by a US distributor, or you know, do you put it into a different kind of production? So, focusing in on Australian television in particular, the dominance of US content is not new, and it has a historical basis. Would you guys, what percentage of your television viewing would be American television?
Probably 99% of it, thinking about like anything really Australian stuff I watch is The Chase. Well, the one that's done here.
Yeah.
And like Channel 7 News or like the Robbins.
Yeah. So more the sort of news, current affairs stuff, and then for your dramas and comedies and stuff.
Yeah, like all that stuff kind of comes from Netflix or like online, which is pretty much all made in America.
Yep. Would people generally agree with that? Maybe not 99%.
I don't often watch television, but I watch a lot of YouTube, and most of the YouTubers I watch are American.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that's the idea when you talk about when people, I guess, complain about globalization of the media, is the idea that there are sort of economies of scale that allow some producers and some producing countries to be a lot stronger than others and make it difficult to compete in various kinds of spheres. This is not new. In fact, because Australian television was started so late, we were so slow. I feel ashamed of us, we were so slow. But almost getting towards 20 years after the UK, 10 to 15 years, depending on where you are in the US, you had a situation that when Australian television started, Canada already had colour TV, and we started in black and white. So the idea was that we didn't really have the content, and it was a game of catch-up. So most of the early stars came from radio, for example, and there was a lot of live filming and these sorts of things, and that was what... And that kind of continued for a long time because it is much cheaper to buy a production from elsewhere than to mount your own production. Essentially, that is the case. Some things are very expensive to buy, but that means they're usually popular, and then it's worth it. There was a relatively brief shift in the 1970s that was driven by consumption. So Australian audiences started to very much focus on Australian productions and demand. There was a sense that they wanted more Australian productions. And this is when we had a big shift in terms of the amount of, say, comedy and drama and soaps and these sorts of things that were coming out, some of which were really, really quite out there in relation to the rest of the world. We were doing things in the 1970s that no one else was doing in terms of, I guess, language, you know, full frontal nudity on Channel 10, these sorts of things that you wouldn't really expect, but that were there. And certainly, I guess, there was a particular kind of Australian television culture as a result of that. Of course, you do have those traditional barriers when audiences started to lose interest, or it simply just became cheaper to have the to import other television shows from elsewhere. This began to sort of winnow away to the position that is the case now. So, in this context, what are the solutions for the Australian media industry, but every media industry which is in this position, which is most of them? And the two main ones that have come up in the last 15 years is co-production and international, and placing a huge emphasis on international distribution. So co-production is when two or more production companies and networks from different countries get together to produce something and to make something. The idea of this is, if you are, from a production perspective, is that you can potentially get funding and from both governments. So, say Canada, there's a lot of Canadian co-production, say children's television. So Canada and Australia will both put in a certain amount of money, and then in terms of consumption, you've basically doubled your audience because you can sell it to both markets without it sort of seeming too different in a way. And there's usually into these texts. This was very popular in Europe in the early 2000s, late 90s, and they used to call them Euro puddings, because sometimes they would have something like 7 different countries. The most famous one was called the Spanish Apartment. I don't know if any of you've seen it, but it had, I think, 6 or 7 different countries involved, and the languages of 6 or 7 different European countries spoken with the other ones with subtitles, and people made a lot of fun of this because it felt a bit like a hodgepodge in some ways. But this, I guess, was an experimentation with the idea that maybe you could create something that was global, in that case regional, but you could create a media text that didn't belong to one country, that was sort of spread across countries in production as well as in consumption. The other potential solution, and this is becoming more and more apparent, is that you essentially don't want to make something in a country like Australia unless you have a prospect for international distribution. If you can't sell it to a consumer group, in a consumer market in another country, we just simply don't have the amount of interested population to really support going ahead. Something like Fury Road, which, yes, as we go, arguably, had that huge potential for international distribution. It had done, its prequels had done well before in different countries. It was accessible to American audiences from all around the world. If we think back to that idea when we talk about transmedia, the narrative is not too complicated. Arguably, there really isn't terribly much of a narrative in that film, so it has that accessibility. Television is particularly suitable for globalization, and because it has always been a bit global. As I was saying, we had a lot of American content way back. We have a lot of American content now. We have British content throughout the ABC, for example. The Americans had lots of British content at the beginning, and these sorts of things flow across countries. We're used to, the Kiwis consume a lot of Australian TV because then they have an even smaller media production market, so that there isn't the idea that it is that restricted in that sense, at least in terms of consumption. So we have, of course, also the popularity of formats. So it can be a bit confusing, the difference between formats and genres. So a genre is, a reality show or a game show or a comedy or something like that. A format is something like Idol or Big Brother or anything where the actual show, the Bible, they call them the show Bible, the details of the show are sold onto another country. So, Australian Idol is very much like American Idol. The earliest one to do this very successfully was Big Brother, which was a Dutch show that then sold to the UK, that then sold to Australia and South Africa and Sweden and all around the world. So essentially, you had a global format that everyone was watching, something that was kind of close to the same show, very close to the same show, but localized enough for local audiences to feel like it applied to them or that they could relate to it in some way. This has been particularly common for reality TV because it's very easy to reproduce. There's rules, there's formats, you can just put in a new cast every time, but it isn't always reality TV. So you see something like the show Homeland. I don't know if any of you know this show Homeland, which is a drama that was translated from an Israeli show called Prisoners of War. So I guess that idea that you translate, sometimes you translate across Linguistic barriers. So Wilfred, which was an Australian show, ended up an FX show in the US that starred Elijah Wood. And I guess then the question is, to what extent is that just spreading the same television around the world? Because lots of these things are quite generic. And to what extent is there a translation of the series, which actually can reveal quite interesting things about a culture as to how they would like to reinterpret something like this. It could be argued that translation of series tends to go one way. So, for example, we watch American shows, but not as many, and British shows, but not as many American. Isn't as much consumption on the other side. That has to do with volume as well as other things. But it also has to do with but there's also, I guess, then local variations. So in the Netherlands, for example, I don't know if any of you have been to the Netherlands. They, I was extremely taken by how amazing everyone's English was, and then realized that all the television was in English. There was no dubbing, it was all just subtitles. So basically from birth, you're constantly watching TV in English. Of course, that's going to, help in your learning. Whereas in, say, somewhere like Germany or Italy, they actually dub voices onto these productions. So again, this is global, but you're experiencing it potentially in your own language or as other, but reading the subtitles. So it's a bit complicated that way. So I'm going to show you I'm going to show you a couple of clips from Australian TV, as you see, ABC Kids, and ask you what you think in terms of the ways in which they are potentially a global text, or what it is that enables that.
While waiting for Zap to deliver their parcels. Django was up to his usual tricks. Where was Zap with his parcels? They waited and waited and waited. Then Mimi had an idea. Why don't they go and find out what happened to Zap? All they had to do was get up to Zap's house.
I won't make you watch more of that, but unless you're desperate to know if they get up to Zap's house. And this is another clip from the same show.
奇妙小镇的居民们正在为今晚的元宵节做着各式准备。浆果、 在打扫广场，秀秀在挂着花篮儿，琪琪把所有的装。
Okay, so what do you notice?
They've like got a different narrator and it's in a different language.
Yes? So different languages, different narrators. Very easy, very cheap to replace a narrator relative to other things. Other observations?
There was no text in it. It was just them acting and doing some of the things.
Yeah.
Pretty much nothing to identify in the country. It's just you put the voiceover over it, it can go anywhere.
Yep. Yep. So it sort of, I'm repeating for this. So it sort of allows allows you not to really notice what country it is because it's very generic in that respect.
They use no dialogue, but also just very generic, like over-exaggerated acting.
Yes.
Just to convey what they're trying to show.
Definitely. And over-exaggerated acting is a curse of children's television in general. But I think it is particularly prominent here, and it is something that is perhaps, you know, someone going, is easier than to convey more generally. So when we talked about representation and kids' drawings in that second week, that idea that there are visual things as a different way of communicating potentially. Yep, yep. Yes. And I guess having a diverse or a balanced cast, I think it says something about the overwhelming whiteness of Australian television that you know, that this is, you know, a thing to have a diverse cast, but it is in that context. Yes?
Yeah, the overwhelming ones, like, well, especially American stuff. I mean, you think of like a big budget American movie. Like, as far as I know, I think Moonlight was the only like really acclaimed movie that all had a cast not filled with white people. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it is a wider media phenomenon, and I guess part of part of the anxieties, the well-founded anxieties about globalization, is the idea that whatever group is in whatever country, whatever group, whatever social norms are in power, are going to be then reproduced throughout the world. So. This is an interesting one in terms of there's a production company that sells themselves as an educational foundation called the Australian Children's Television Foundation, and it's their production. They pitched it to sell it in this format both to the ABC and to Chinese Central Television. Now, obviously, we're talking about very different potential markets, at least in terms of size, and this is then potentially very useful for them when they're pitching to get funding and to do things, to be able to say, well, we are going to be able to market this beyond our home territory. So it's that idea of they're very much focused towards the international distribution, because in some ways, the whole point of this show is the international distribution. It's structured. The way the text is structured is very much focused on that idea that it can be consumed cross-culturally, and as such, it is really a global text, or at least a transnational text in that respect, in a way. That something like Nickelodeon's Ni Hao Kai Lan, do you know this? No. Clearly none of you have toddlers. It's a Nickelodeon show that's focused, and you know, there's a little girl, and you learn different words in Mandarin by her going, by her going, Ni Hao, blah, 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 which is hello, and then they have a gap for the child to say it and then she goes, well done, and you know, so it's very, I would consider that not to be a global format, because, despite its thematics, because it's more actually just about a particular audience rather than being about two different audiences, if that makes sense. And we're talking more than two audiences there, because the reason that you have the subtitles while Mandarin's being spoken is for Cantonese viewers and all the other Chinese dialects to be able to access it as well. So this is a show that only launched this year, the end of last year, called Kazoops. It is a co-production between the production houses are two Australian production houses called Mighty Nice and Cheeky Little Cheeky, and it's a co-production between Netflix, the ABC, and the BBC. So both three nations and two very different kinds of program in terms of the online streaming and then the other ones, though online streaming is a big deal for the ABC as well. So Fireman Sam usually is in the top 5 of Ratings 5. You may not know that, but it is true. So I will show you this and tell me what you notice.
My name is Monty, and I'm 6 years old. And this is my best friend, Jimmy Jones. Like you, there are lots of things about life that make me stop and wonder. Just imagine, like whether it's really important for my socks to match, or whether games always need rules, or whether all monsters really are scary. And when I start wondering, my big imagination goes wild and takes me and Jimmy Jones on the most amazing journeys where we see things in a new way. I have some cool toy friends like Zappa the Robot or Susie the Velociraptor who come with me on my adventures. Oh, and one of my awesome toy vehicles helps us get there and back. When we're not away on our imaginary adventures, me and Jimmy Jones live here at home with the rest of the family. They're a bit, well, different, but I think that's a good thing. So, join me and Jimmy.
All right. So what did you notice? Quite cute.
It does kind of follow the conventions of like every kid's show the exact photo, which isn't exactly a bad thing. It's just unexpected.
Yeah. Yeah. So the narrative format within the episode is basically he's doing something, a question he wonders about arises, he goes into imagination world, and then he knows the answer to the question, which is exactly, so yes, it does follow some, but not all of them. Yep. Very popular imagination world at the moment in these shows. Why do you think they have chosen to do, for something made in Australia, primarily, why have they chosen to put it in English accent?
They add a little appeal to the English audiences and they can make more money.
Yep, yep. And it's actually hugely popular in the UK, apparently.
I feel like it's happened medium. Like, a lot of Americans find our accent hard to understand, but they do understand English accent and we understand English accent.
Yeah, yep, definitely. So that I guess something everyone can understand, which is an important part of that idea of global media. There is, in terms of the design, it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. They have a San Francisco house, like distinctively, and English wallpaper, which is a thing. They have all these crazy pattern wallpaper. But the house design within the house is an American-style house, and if you look at the details of it, they really have kind of mixed everything together in a way. There's also the case that within these productions, even things that are not officially co-producing with a particular country, you have you have a lot of work. Something like this is a huge amount of work, and they have multiple production countries all around the world working on it. So, you know, they might send off all the backgrounds and the interiors to somewhere in Korea, and they might send off, you know, one particular character to somewhere else, or the color correction somewhere else. So I guess that idea that all of these things are, all of the media is very global now in terms of its production, even when it's not clearly signposted as 3 countries like it is here. And you can see in this graph the increases in terms of Screen Australia funding for co-productions. You'll note that there's a lot more children's co-productions. This has to do, again, this has to do with I guess, things that are trying to prevent the global media in a way, which are sort of, I guess, more protectionist media policies. So there's policies about how much Australian content for kids has to be screened in a way that it's not as intense for Australian content for adults. One of the first fears for, one of the reasons TV was introduced so late in Australia was that politicians were horrified that it would, you know, degrade Australian minds, but also that kids would develop American accents. So I guess there is this idea still that we need the children to have these texts, and that's particularly important. And these are the number of co-productions. Now, these countries have specific deals with Australia for co-productions, which means that both countries can contribute money and that sort of thing. There are, of course, other co-productions that are more informal, but these are the main players. Netflix has, of course, played a huge role, being online, opening up where it once was, you know, quite locked in, opening up in many different countries, being so popular, allows for that idea of quite global text. So a little while ago I watched a Norwegian TV show on Netflix, and it was very entertaining, and I would never have otherwise gotten my hands on a Norwegian television show. I don't think. So I guess there's that idea that because it's not a limited schedule, and this is the platform question, you can put on more different texts because it doesn't really matter how many things you have up there for people to stream. In fact, the more the better in the Netflix model. So pre-sales, for example, and pre-production with Sundance TV in the US allowed for the production of Cleverman, season 2 coming up of that. And Netflix in the US now actually has a subgenre of Australian television and Australian film. So I guess that's the idea that global audiences do want to actually consume the national cinemas of different countries. So would you like a break, or would you like me to continue? Do you want a break? Who wants? Break? Okay, take a 5-minute break. I will see you back here at 9:57. Let's make it 10. I'll see you back here at 10. If anyone has special questions to ask me, feel free to come down. makes it easier to absorb, I think. Like, and this is, I guess, is a directional thing, that what you're used to consuming, you know, people go for what they're used to. And as you were saying, if you feel you can't understand Australian accents because you haven't listened to Australian accents all your life. We've listened to British accents all our lives, you know, on TV. And so it makes it easier to sell to your target demographic if you can easily change it. And I think that's why animations do so well. Something like The Simpsons, I think. There's lots of reasons why it did well, but it was very translatable in that respect. So, yeah, you've got that element. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I've only ever seen the British one. Yeah, so there you go. Yeah, and there's an American Fireman Sam as well, which is just the new voices. So I think part of it's that anxiety about kids and accents, but it's also, yeah, there's also that question of how much can you sell it to different markets, I guess. So, yeah, we don't like to think of these things for kids being so mercantile. Exactly. So, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
This was English text in the original Japanese one. They just decided to move every single text, even the sign goes up and blank.
And I guess you can do that in a way. You just can't do that in a live action. At least not to the same extent. Dubbing looks horrible. I mean, if you're used to it, I think it's fine. But it looks horrible if you're not used to it. Did you have a question for me?
No, just I was thinking it should make sense, like a show real dog drama about which cat they had.
Yes. Oh, not the recent one. No, just the old school.
No, it's just it's like he does this crappy cooking show parody where it's like the kids ask like, "We have cupcakes." And like, oh yeah, it's a cupcake. So it's like just for the sake of the running joke.
Okay, fair enough.